The book is almost
like a totem.
Exactly. It's just like the excuse. It's like the vehicle to create an event. Same thing with like media. Like, why couldn't I have gone on CNN a year ago?
Yeah.
It's the same, but it's like you need like the book.
It doesn't actually make sense.
No, it's like anchoring tool. Exactly. Hey, Liz. Good. Thanks for coming, Liz.
All right. Welcome to Berkeley. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? I can still adjust the volume up. Is everyone okay?
Very cool.
How about in the back there? Who's back there? Everyone's okay? All right.
Oh, interesting.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming. My name is Dan McDunn. I'm the host of this. I just want to thank my family and wife for putting up with the party, and thank my neighbors for putting up with the parking. Kind of long time coming to this point after 5 years of this saga here in Berkeley, one of the darkest places actually during the pandemic. I want to just take a quick note. Maybe you don't know this, but Berkeley is home to one of the finest public research institutions in the world. Just pointing that out before we dive into this conversation, okay? Yeah, I met David during the pandemic, became acquainted with his writing, and then had opportunity to connect when he was doing some research on the book. I won't go into the incident, but he was wanting to know what was going on precisely in Berkeley, and I shared that with him. I had an opportunity to meet him in New York a couple of summers ago, became fast friends and stayed in touch. And so as this book came to fruition, I reached out and said, hey, David, you would like to host a book party in the home of the finest research institution in the world. Yet one of the darkest places during the pandemic. So, without further ado, I want to turn the mic over to David and to Lee Fang, who's joining us here, and let them go from here. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
Well, I want to just kind of have a conversation with Dave, and then we can open it up to questions. Dave and I met during the Twitter files. I had admired his work. I read it in New York Magazine, and Atlantic, and elsewhere. We kind of immediately bonded doing that research at Twitter's HQ. But I just want to make a quick comment here. When you're doing kind of, I don't know what's the right word for it, but adversarial work or research on a topic where you're really the black sheep and you're cutting against the grain of a consensus opinion, oftentimes, the folks who have the personality or disposition to question authority and question public opinion, oftentimes they're a little bit kooky, they're a little bit weird, they get things wrong sometimes, and it makes questioning authority even more difficult. But Dave is not that. As someone who's so even keel, who's so careful about the facts, who is a traditional reporter in every sense, in a positive sense, who really kind of goes out and gathers the facts. And for such a big topic where there's been so much controversy, so much misinformation, so many bad facts, it's great to have a book that's put together and really deconstructs this crisis that we had, this catastrophe that we had, from a place of rigorous journalistic authority. So I just want to give it to you for that. Wow. It's a really incredible book.
Wow. It's quite an introduction.
But yeah, let's just get into it. What was the genesis of writing this book? What put you on this path?
In February and March, like most Americans, and I live just north of New York City. I wasn't knowledgeable about what was happening. I was going along with what the CDC and whoever else was saying. And we locked down, and I'm a little ashamed to admit we even, there may have been some groceries that were wiped down briefly. But at the same time, I observed from day one, my kids who were in 3rd and 5th grade at the time, they started the remote learning, and it was obvious from day one. I was like, this is not going to work over the long term. I wasn't thinking that, it was just sort of in my head that this seemed like this was kind of crazy. But everyone remembers they sort of flattened the curve. 15 days to slow the spread. That was there's a White House document. That's the title of it. It's 15 days to slow the spread. I'm like, okay. And the purpose was, and we can get into this, Lee, the purpose was to flatten the curve, which means so the hospitals don't get overwhelmed. You want to have a smooth slope rather than a spike. And that was the plan. So I was going along with that. But I'm an inquisitive person. My journalism prior to the pandemic, I read a lot of scientific papers. I enjoy talking with academics. So pretty quickly, while I was going along with the sort of consensus establishment view on things, I also just wanted to kind of poke around on my own. And things started to seem a little strange to me, but I wasn't quite sure. And I would say that the sort of one of the main moments that kind of led me on the path where I sort of shifted from just personally, because I was in the middle of writing another book at the time. So I certainly professionally didn't even want to get involved in this. But the thing that shifted gears for me was toward the end of April. Well, let me rewind for one moment. We had 15 days. You all may or may not recall, at the expiration of 15 days, they immediately added another 30 days onto it. There was a press conference, and my recollection is there was very little, close to zero analysis or pushback on the idea of, well, wait a minute, they said 15 days, now we're adding another 30 on top of it. And so that seemed strange to me. And then in April, the cases in New York City, because I live just north of New York, the cases had fallen by 50% by the end of the month. And I was talking with a friend of mine. I recount this in the book. We were walking on the high school track. We were separated between like lanes 1 and 4 to be safe at the time. It's a little embarrassing now, but hey, this is April 2020. And I said to him, because I was already digging into this stuff, and I said, "We did it, man. We flattened the curve." So I said, "Cases have fallen. When do you think they're going to open schools? Like next week or something?" And he was like, "Dave, they're not opening." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? We did it. That was the mission. Was you have to flatten the curve." We all followed the instructions. We stayed home, particularly in my area, which is like the Berkeley of Westchester County, New York. So very compliant population. And I just had this the hairs on the back of my neck went up, and he was like, "They're not going back." And I was like, holy shit, am I this naive? Like, what is happening? It was almost an unreality. And that's when the switch just flipped for me. And the main reason I got into it professionally was because no one seemed to be writing any of this. And I couldn't believe it. I kept digging around. I'm like, where are the articles questioning that they added another 30 days? Why aren't I seeing this anywhere? And then where are the articles talking about the schools being closed? This seems so weird. And I kept digging and digging. I'm like, this is a horrible situation, but this is awesome for me. I'm gonna but I've got to move quickly because everyone's gonna be on this. But I'm on it quickly. So the very first article that I wrote, I started pitching around. I had written a piece, a number of pieces for the New York Times before, and it was just a few weeks earlier. It was like the number one most read piece in the whole paper. It was on this newlyweds who got stuck in the Maldives after like the whole world shut down. So it's like, they know me there. I'd emailed the science editor. She's like, "Oh yeah, we're covering this." I'm like, shit, now I'm gonna get scooped on this, because my pitch for freelance writers, you have to send a pitch to someone. It has to be really tight and really persuasive quickly. And I just had this compendium of evidence. I mean, it was just like bullet points, of just like, there's this study and this study and this study. And no one's talking about this. I was like, I'm going to crush this. Everyone passed on it. So finally, there was an editor at Wired, which is not known for political journalism, but it has the science basis to it. And he said, "Oh yeah, let's do this." And I'm like, "Listen, man, we've got to move quickly. Everyone's going to start writing about this. We're going to get scooped." And so the article came out in the beginning of May, the very beginning of May, which was the case for opening schools. And that was it. After that, I was branded a murderer and a right-wing lunatic. And here I am. So thank you for coming to see The Murderer Lunatic. There we go.
That just took away my next question. When you became the murderer and lunatic, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think virtually every school district in that spring of 2020 closed down. And genuinely, in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of information. It wasn't clear what society should do. When do you think it became apparent that the experts were not acting based on evidence? When did it actually, were there pivot points? And can you walk a little bit along the chronology of how did we get from, okay, there's this pandemic that no one saw coming, to, okay, now we don't care about the evidence. We're going to start acting in a kind of rudderless matter here.
So I would say it kind of starts from the beginning with these playbooks that I talk about a lot in the book. I refer to them as a playbook. I don't know if that's the technical term, but these are the guidebooks put out by our government. And two of them from the CDC are particularly important. Many of the public health officials mentioned them by name. People from the CDC, when they were giving press conferences, referred to this report. There was the first one came out in 2007, and then a revision came out in 2017. And regarding schools, I mean, we can touch on the broader pandemic response, but I sort of use schools as the lens through which to see the broader topic. But they have a section in there where they say you can close schools for 2 weeks if you're trying to figure out what's going on. Sort of like, this is just take a breather. There's some new crazy things happening. That's reasonable. Do it for 2 weeks and you'll try to assess the situation. So I think it could be argued, the way I refer to it is, it was reasonable but wrong to close the schools at all in the beginning. But based on, if you're at least following the guidebook, where we went off the rails is when it went beyond 2 weeks, quite honestly, because that's not what the guidebook said. Now, I should say, as you all know, once you go through the book, the guidebooks are deeply, deeply flawed. They are based on a lot of really, really dubious assumptions in there. That it's very unsettling. It's a house of cards, like a statistical house of cards. It's crazy. So but as dubious as they are, it still was created in a sober manner, not during an emergency. And this at least was a plan. So we really were 2 steps removed. That the guidebook itself wasn't so great, and we weren't even following the guidebook. And it's not like we were becoming more reasonable. We were moving even further, kind of reaching escape velocity, just kind of like disappearing from. So I think those were starting with just the plan. And then the thing that I harp on the most, because this is what, at least for me personally, what seemed like it, again, that another unreal moment was schools started opening in Europe at the end of April and the beginning of May. And I didn't understand why that was happening. And it wasn't like, I mean that genuinely. I was like, wait, I'm confused. Again, I'm that idiot where I was like, but we flattened the curve. Why aren't they opening the school? Like, I just approached it like a naive person or saying it didn't make sense to me. 22 countries began reopening their schools in Europe. The education ministers from those countries all met at the EU toward the end of May. And during that meeting, they said, we have observed no negative consequence of opening these schools here. Again, this is not like a little hut schoolhouse in Tibet with 12 kids. This is Europe with millions of children in school. And they announced it. It wasn't mentioned in a blog post. It wasn't, in like an obscure medical journal. This is a meeting at the EU. And I didn't see anything about this anywhere. And that was insane to me. It made no sense and I didn't understand what was going on. And that's why I wrote that first article. So that to me was the real turning point where there's some sort of, I think, plausible kind of deniability of doing something where it's like, no one's open anywhere around the planet, or at least not countries that are similar to ours in many respects. But once Europe opened and we didn't, then it became there was no excuse. You couldn't even say, well, we don't know what's going to happen. We do know what's going to happen. We just saw it. Nothing happened. It was fine. And that was ignored, or we can get into it, or it was dismissed for a long list of contrived reasons.
Well, can we talk a little bit about the media? Like, if I remember in those spring months of 2020, there were very inflammatory headlines from The Atlantic and the New York Times and others that claim that states that began opening up, and Georgia and Florida were kind of sending people to their deaths, that folks who advocated a loosening of some of the restrictions were anti-science. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, that media coverage, was it based on evidence? Where was it coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I guess perhaps because, in the media, but much of the book and much of my thinking for the last number of years has been about media. This is, in many regards, a work of media criticism. Because, again, like, I didn't intend to be a contrarian. I'm happy if people like me. Like, I don't seek that, because there are some people who sort of enjoy that. Like, I wasn't seeking that out, but again, like, this was virtually non-existent. The idea, the first bunch of articles I was writing, the only people who were tweeting them or talking about them were like, Brit Hume at Fox and, maybe, and Rand Paul. And then there was a tiny sliver, though, it's interesting, is there was a tiny sliver of people who I'm pretty sure on the left were academics. So small, though, but nevertheless, and then some of them dropped off once they saw that they weren't allowed to say that anymore. But in the beginning, so there was this massive gap between either it's like Fox and, Ant Coulter and those people, or like a tiny sliver of people who work in academia or in health, in the health field, and no one else. And that includes the media. Because one of the things that I talk about in the book and that I think about a lot is, like, many of the powerful institutions in our country tend to have a similar type of, political leaning. They tend to be like center left, I would argue. And some could say, far left, depending how you want to think about it. But they tend to work, as kind of a blob. And there was something that happened with the media, where generally the legacy media are the same type of people who also work in public health and the broader medical establishment. And the idea of going against your tribe, most people, and this includes journalists, sadly, which is weird to me because you're obviously not like that, Lee. Most people, it's far more important to them to be accepted by their peers. Thank God there are people like Lee who just want to follow where the facts take them, and whoever it pisses off, then so be it. And that's what we observed was, we can get into it more, but there really was no quote unquote dissenting coverage. There's sprinkled a little bit here and there. I'm not a genius or brilliant. All I did was just try to follow what seemed like really, really manifestly obvious. And I kept questioning myself because I'm like, why isn't anyone talking about this? What did I miss? I'm confused. But I think they just didn't care. Even if most of them weren't aware of it, or if they were aware, they just kept their mouths shut.
This mantra that I'm sure if you live in the Bay Area, you've seen this on lawn signs, believe in science, trust the science, that became, it wasn't just something that people said as a kind of cultural signifier. I believe Pfizer in the spring of 2020 did a national ad campaign of trusting the science. It was like something that became this phrase that you just had to repeat ad nauseum without question. What does that mean? What does it mean to trust the science? How did they come up with some of the rules for the lockdowns? And when they said, we have to keep the schools closed to prevent spread, what were they saying? Where was this coming from?
Yeah, so I'll just touch on before I get to that.
It wasn't science.
Yeah, well, the irony of, it's novelistic. You would almost think it's like lazy or contrived if you were reading a book or watching a movie about this. If this pandemic didn't happen, if it was fictionalized, the fact that all of the people in this house, we believe in science, actually had no fucking clue what they were talking about. The irony, it's like a little too on the nose. It was just come on, that's a little too much. Can we be a little more subtle with that? So the irony of that was just exquisite. But as far as the rules, they were made up. And I used to be much harder on this. My editor at The Atlantic, because I went back and forth with him, where I had a bunch of lines in one of my articles where I was really pushing hard against various benchmarks and things. He said, look, it is reasonable to have a benchmark. Otherwise, people don't even have a clue about what to do. So I've softened on the idea of coming up with an idea, with having a benchmark for something to reach toward, because otherwise, like, words like be careful or be safe mean very different things to everyone. And from an administrative perspective, school administrators and others like simply wouldn't know how to behave. The problem is the degree of certainty within which these rules or guidance was projected to the public. And what happened was, so these rules were made up, to answer your question, but we then came into a situation, I don't know if they did this in Berkeley when the schools eventually did open here a long, long time later, but in New York where I was, they eventually opened in the fall, but there were, what you saw around the country were classrooms with janitors and teachers and others with a ruler, with like measuring precisely 6 feet. It couldn't be a little bit under, with like a carpenter's precision. This thing, as if they were, handed, the 6 feet has been handed down to Moses, on the mountain, and everyone's like, we must comply with 6 feet. We must comply with 6 feet. So the problem wasn't necessarily that there was a benchmark, but that the benchmark wasn't something to kind of like aim for aspirationally, but let's like keep our heads about it, which is what the American Academy of Pediatrics initially said before Trump said to open the schools, and then they reversed their guidance. We can talk about that, but
yeah, talk a little bit more about that.
So what I'm describing here, this idea of like, maybe you should aim for something, but it doesn't need to be, this religious, adherence to it. That's what the American Academy of Pediatrics more or less had said in its initial guidance in like late spring, early summer. And they said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it was, look, get kids in school. This is really important. There's going to be tremendous harm, particularly for underprivileged kids who don't have resources. They're screwed if you keep them out of school for a long time. We've got to get them back in school. Now, bear in mind, kids had already been out of school for an unprecedented amount of time. People forget, everyone talks about the year that followed. Let's not forget, that was really bad, even to be closed from March all the way through June in much of the country. So something really bad and a lot of harm was incurred during that time. But let's set that aside for a moment. They saw what happened. They said, let's get the kids in school. They also said, don't worry about 6 feet of distancing. If you can, try for it. But our advice is just 3 feet, that's okay. No matter what, just get the kids in there. Donald Trump, a short while after, tweeted something to the effect of, open the schools in the fall, all caps, with like a bunch of exclamation points, as is, his style. And when Donald Trump did that, he ensured that schools in half our country would remain closed. And immediately after Trump tweeted that, the AAP put out revised guidance. Gone was the idea of get kids in school no matter what. Gone was the saying, don't worry about 6 feet of distancing so much. That wasn't in there anymore. Instead, the primary point was listen to the experts, and we need an enormous amount of money to open schools. And the other part of that statement was who co-authored it, which were the two largest teachers unions in the country. So if that answers your question about how the guidance came about.
Children don't have representatives. Like when we want to make public policy, there are people that are around a table or something to that effect. And just like with any medical intervention, any big public policy decision has a cost benefit. Some people lose, some people benefit, and it's complicated. It didn't seem like children had an advocate here. If the teachers' unions were in a partisan sense or whatever you think their motivation was, they weren't necessarily advocating for the kids. Could you talk a little bit about the ramifications of these closures? I think all of us know here, we live in California. We had a governor who put his own children in private school that remained open while he rigorously campaigned to keep public schools closed. This had disparate impacts, I believe. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. While he was having dinner at French Laundry.
Yeah.
As probably, unfortunately, many of you here know, the impacts were extensive. And before I'll keep it brief because I try not to. I do have a section in the book where I just kind of hammer away at the harms, but it's really just one section. I try to stay away from that. Primarily, and maybe this is a mistaken idea, but it just seems so obvious how the harms that I'm like, I don't need to focus on that. I'm more interested in the sort of what are the gears turning behind the scenes and how does our society work. That was more intellectually engaging for me rather than just recounting a bunch of horror stories. The thing that I try to tell people, because, and I suspect a lot of you here perhaps have similar experience to mine back in New York, which is that most of the people that I know and am friendly with, they live in a comfortable home. Their kids were doing okay. Plenty of them had kids who suffered, but by and large, they were kind of like, this sucks, but no one liked it, but they're like, oh well, It was kind of, that's like sort of the feeling that, and that's the feeling I think people still have to this day of like, this thing happened, it was bad, but like, The problem with that is obviously the lens through which you're living your own life obviously distorts oftentimes what you're able to see. And another irony, is that the left, which purports to be the champions of the underprivileged the most, they were the ones, their advocacy for school closures harmed the very people that they cared about the most, at least ostensibly. And I found it to be extraordinarily frustrating, enraging even, that these people who my whole life are wagging their finger at me. And by the way, I should add, I was a smug liberal of sorts, but I've always been an independent, but I had this attitude that I observe now all the time. I'm like able to see it from the outside, whereas before I was just in it. But this kind of very arrogant finger wagging about, and the virtue. I'm such a good person, and you're such an asshole. I am good, you're bad. We know that. We both know this, right? So that attitude was just permeated everything and was enraging. And what they didn't see, or what they chose not to see, and what they waved away with a long list of complete bullshit excuses, was that number one, and I always mention this because it's just the sort of punch in the gut initially, is that when schools closed, cases of child abuse skyrocketed. And the irony is, again, I'll try not to keep using the word the irony, but is that the reports of cases went down. And you might think that means, great, there's not as much child abuse. But what actually happened is that teachers and educators are the first resource. They're the first line, helpline for a child who's in danger. That's where they're noticed in a school building. That's like, this is how it gets reported. So when they closed schools, those kids had nowhere to go. And many of them were left at home with a monster. I almost get choked up thinking about it. And I want to be clear about this. This was observed and known in April of 2020. These people in charge who work in healthcare, they knew about it and they didn't give a shit. So it's like incredibly important that like the record is set straight, because there's, understandably so, people don't want to feel culpable for this, but they caused this to those kids. Now, someone could argue, we're willing to tolerate, however many thousands of kids who are going to get the shit beat out of them, but it's worth it. It's worth it. Now, someone wants to try to make that argument, they can, but they didn't make that argument. They just didn't talk about it. But this was known from the beginning. And we can and I'll very quickly just run through the list. But beyond that, everyone talks about learning loss, and rightfully so. And I have lots of good statistics in the book. There was a direct correlation between the time out of school and the degree of learning loss that occurred and drop in test scores. It's really important. We should talk about it. But that misses a larger point, all this talk about learning loss and the test scores. And the larger point that I think about a lot and that I observed with my own kids is that there's a long list of harms, of these sort of like cascading effects of when schools closed. And the example I often think about, because I interviewed a guy who runs a program for football players in underprivileged areas in New York City. And he was just apoplectic when schools closed, because when schools close, that also means everything else that's adjacent, to a school closes. And when you think about like a poor kid in the Bronx who was perhaps going to be the first kid in his family to ever go to college, and he was relying on a scholarship for playing football. Well, what do you think happened to him when the football season was terminated? His entire life trajectory has been altered now, that kid. So those things don't show up in statistics. Missing your senior prom, missing third grade.
Yeah.
Like all of this shit, that's not going to be in the statistics, but it was real. It happened. And I take great objection to the term that kids are resilient. The example I often give is, if someone punches you in the face and you get a black eye, it'll heal within a week or 2 weeks. You don't see it anymore, but you surely still experienced a punch in the face. These kids, even if we can't articulate, it's sort of this ineffable thing that happened to them, they still experience something. And mostly, even if they didn't have a permanent scar, figuratively or literally, they missed an entire year of school, a lot of them, and they weren't spending it, doing wonderful things with project-based learning and frolicking in the forest, most of them. They were just sitting in a fucking bedroom on a computer for a while, if at all. More than yeah, I should say. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm that's why I'm here, right? I've fallen victim to my own sort of elitist lens of how long it was here. Yes.
How do you respond to critics or proponents of the lockdowns or the school closures that said, okay, well, sure, but we were at some level preventing the spread of disease because these kids were not becoming vectors for COVID-19 and bringing it back home. We at least saved some lives by closing down the schools. Can you talk a little bit about that?
One of the most important things, and I hope everyone here, well, the next time you're at a cocktail party and people make that claim, is that my entire book just about is written with information that was known at the time. There's very, very little, and I try to, sort of break the fourth wall and tell the reader, I'm now referring to a study that was done, after the fact. But other than that, what I try to do is show this is what was known at the time. And we go back to Europe again. We knew this was the best this is better than a study because it's not contrived with parameters. This was just reality of millions of kids who were in school. And this was across a wide range of geographic area. They had a wide range of population densities, a wide range of case rates in different parts. It didn't matter because one of the excuses that was given was, well, that's Europe. They controlled the virus. That's a lie. It was complete bullshit. Yes, if you look on a countrywide level, certain countries appear better, but America is huge. Why does it matter what's happening in Baton Rouge if you're in Berkeley? So the idea of how they framed it was completely false. So we knew from the beginning, because we had millions of kids who were in school there and nothing happened. If you look at the case rates in Europe after schools opened, this is what they did. They went down. I'm not suggesting that schools cause cases to go down, but what that does suggest quite strongly is that opening schools was not going to lead to a catastrophe. The kids were not super spreaders. It was just manifestly visible that wasn't happening. So, and now retrospectively, there are a number of studies on this. There was zero benefit. I want to be really clear on this. Anytime someone says this to you, if they do, is there was zero benefit. So this wasn't a trade-off that kids did. This was only harm. Zero benefit, only harm.
There were a lot of overlapping heuristics during the 2020 year. Another one, in addition to the pandemic, was racial issues around identity. I used to work at The Intercept, investigative website, kind of on the left, and they did a lot of great stuff, but there were some issues that I would raise. One being that we had a science contributor who wrote a lot of reporting around advocating lockdowns and closures of schools, but when there were protests in the kind of wake of George Floyd, they argued that racism is more dangerous than the pandemic. And in that sense, people needed to protest. People needed to break these lockdowns. And it seemed like, okay, well, perhaps there are certain emotional shortcuts that get people around the kind of logical inconsistencies in these arguments. you talk a little bit about the use of race here? Because there was, maybe to use this term again, there was an irony here that some of the children who were most harmed by the lockdowns were minority, African-American, Latino students, yet the arguments to maintain the closures of the schools was the defense of Black and brown students. Was the invocation of race to justify this when they didn't have the evidence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot, and that that's a really important theme in the book, is that our intuitions are often wrong, and this is especially in medicine. And intuitively, it makes sense. If you open schools, that will increase cases. I understand why a regular person would think that. There's some degree of kind of like logic behind it. Well, of course, kids have runny noses, the schools are packed, like that's where they're... But the reality is, and I give a zillion examples of this in the book, I think someone who wrote a review recently said, like, this book will destroy your faith in the experts. It's like you can't come away from this without just being completely shattered. And because what we see over and over and over again throughout history, including recent history, I'm not talking about, hundreds of years ago, is that things that we think will work don't work. Things that we think are true are actually not true with medicine and with public health. And the reality is that people, and I talk a lot about implementation science in the book, which is this like field within medicine where they study how do you get people to comply with stuff? And when they don't comply, why is it? How do you get people within a hospital to always wash their hands, the staff? How do you get patients to take, their pills and things like that? And what we know from implementation science is that people, this is obvious, people tend to not comply with things that are really uncomfortable. That's why oftentimes if there's 5 giant horse pills that give you a headache and make you nauseous, they know a certain number of patients just aren't going to take them after a while. You know what? Instead, I'm going to give you this one pill. It's not quite as effective, but I know that the patient's going to take it. So we know that people don't comply with things. They might initially, but it drops off. And sure enough, I talk about this in the book, is that cellular phone data shows this. Very shortly after things were closed, people started moving around well before, they were, told officially they could, not because they're assholes, but because they're human. And the same thing with wearing, this is also why mask mandates are not effective, because the studies for masks are done on mannequins where they glue the mask to the mannequin's face. This is part of what the CDC used as its justification. When you look through the citations, because I'm a crazy person and I read every single citation, some of these studies are on mannequins where they're glued onto their face. That is not how a human acts. It's certainly not how a kid acts, okay? But anyone, including, by the way, doctors and health professionals are very bad at wearing masks for a long time too, because it's just, in order for it to be effective, it needs to be basically sealed onto your face where no air can get around the perimeter at all. That's extraordinarily uncomfortable. So wearing a mask, staying sequestered in your home, that's not something people do by choice or, if they're able. The other kind of dovetail to that point is that a significant portion of our population was still out and about because they had to be. So while the laptop class, while the good people, the virtuous people stayed home, this was one of the most class-based events in American history because you couldn't have scripted it better. You had the schlubs, the poor people, the bad people, they were out delivering the good people their food. They were in the slaughterhouses. They were fixing, the infrastructure, electricity, the plumbing of our society. They were keeping things moving while the good people could stay home and feel good about themselves and let the other people deliver them their stuff and let the other people go to the Amazon warehouse and handle all that. But the point is, well, where did those people's kids go? All the people who weren't home. So they, of course, had to go somewhere. Either they stayed home alone or they went to a grandparent's house or a neighbor, or they got together with a bunch of other kids. Like I was told by many people, a woman who lived in Watts area of LA, she said, the kids were just hanging out together. It didn't matter. Some of them had parents with them, some didn't. No one gave a shit. So very early on, and this is how I got connected with a guy named Martin Kulldorff, whose name might ring a bell for people here. He was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. And when I got connected with Martin, because I was writing an article about, because they were putting this hybrid schedule into the schools in New York, which my kids were subjected to. And this hybrid schedule meant you could only go to school part-time, because in order to comply with 6 feet of distancing, the desks, every classroom had to be half empty. And the idea that, and what Martin said, and some other people who I had interviewed for the article, was this is very, very flawed reasoning, because it's based on an assumption that none of these kids are going to be mixing with each other when the school's closed. And in fact, this likely may be worse, because at least if the school's open, the kids are together, they're in like cohorts, and you're at least with your same class. If you're, a third grader, you might just be with the same 20 kids every day. But instead, you're at a daycare center or, daycare for kids that age, various places, and there are kids from all over the place there. Now you're mixing with kids from 5 other towns. Now you're with grandma, who you might kill, as they told us. So the whole idea of closing schools is going to lower transmission on the surface makes sense. But when you just take one step back and just pause for a moment and think about how human beings actually act and what was going to happen, it was obvious this was never going to work over the long term. And that's exactly what all the evidence showed.
Are you and this is like kind of, I want to ask a question like it goes maybe beyond your book, but the meta
I need
question.
to get to the race stuff. Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah,
I got distracted from race.
Yeah.
I can, do you want me to?
Yeah, actually, just go ahead.
Does anyone want to talk about race? They're going to run me out of town. Right, yeah, the neighbor, that guy just came out on his back deck. He heard me. Sorry. I'm friends with Dan McDonough. Blame him. Yes, as many of you probably observed or even experienced, the pandemic response was highly racialized, the conversation around it, and I'll just touch on it very quickly, which is that where a lot of people, and I assume some people here, if you already were teetering, where people really lost faith in the experts, was when they told everyone you were a complete asshole if you left your house, and then all of a sudden, everything's fine. You can go protest with thousands of people for George Floyd. The hypocrisy was so keen that there actually was an article in The Atlantic by 2 public health professionals, Liz is laughing, that was, the title was something like, "No, public health experts are not hypocrites for saying you should go out," where they had to defend this, even though they were. And the idea that, it is an emergency to I won't get into my thoughts on the George Floyd thing and all those statistics. That's outside of the parameters of this. But that was one piece of it. And then the second piece of it was that people who wanted to open schools were told that they were racist to their face and online and everywhere else. This was fully 100% full stop. This was the accepted narrative. And this was a way to shut down debate. I'm not convinced that people who said this actually believed it. Perhaps some of them did. I don't think most of them believed it. They know that when you do that, when you brand someone a racist, it's over. Like, it's the mic drop, that's it. And most people cannot tolerate being, understandably so, do not want that lobbed at them, saying that they're racist. And I get into it a lot in the book. Needless to say, as you touch, this did not help Black and brown kids at all, keeping them out of school. As we touched on, it wasn't reducing cases. It didn't matter that they lived in multi-generational homes. None of that mattered because it wasn't helping those kids. And in fact, I'll give you a little tidbit in the book. There's some very little known studies, but there's actually some pretty persuasive evidence that little kids, people who lived with children, it actually was protective against severe cases of COVID. And there's several really persuasive studies about this. And it's, in effect, this is a crude way of putting it, kids acted as a vaccine, that they had other coronaviruses, kids were mixing, and once you got exposed to a different coronavirus somewhat recently before you were exposed to SARS-CoV-2, what these studies found was that you were less likely to get infected, or if you did, it was less severe. So on multiple levels, on a biological, scientific level, and on an epidemiological level, it made zero sense to keep those kids out of school.
Are you worried about a boy who cried wolf society-wide issue where, I look back at the last 5 years and it's just, I kind of want to forget parts of it because it's so shocking to dial down into the details as you have. But at some point, we do need public health experts. We need experts. We need people who are preparing us for maybe a much more dangerous pandemic. Maybe another lab leaks or something else at a different wet market. Who knows? We actually get a virus that is harmful to children, that does have a higher mortality rate, something of that nature. We could, maybe AI programs a very powerful virus. Who knows? But we've come to the point where experts are so discredited. What do we do as a society? Are you concerned about that the experts have self-discredited, that we're unprepared as a society? And you just look back in the last month, we're seeing mass cuts to biomedical research, to cancer research. And I get a sense that, I don't know if there's polling on it, but I feel like in any other time in our modern history, most people would be outraged about this. But after the pandemic, there's a little bit more of a shrug of the shoulders, and it's not fair to a lot of these scientists who had no role in these policies, but the culture has shifted so much.
Yeah, I'm very worried about it. Who do you go to? Because things happen, and we can't all just wing it, and we need to rely on people. But unfortunately, the public health establishment, by and large, showed us that they're not up to the task. I don't have an answer. I don't know how they're going to restore trust. It's possible that Jay Bhattacharya and Marty Makary will bring about change. I know both of them and like them. They're also flawed people like everyone, and they have, RFK Jr. and others, and all the way up to Trump. So who knows how the gears of politics turn and what they will or won't be able to do. I will say this, that when I talked with Jay a couple weeks ago, and he told me his first priority, and I don't know if we'll be able to do this or not, but was replication. And I don't know if people know what that means, but in science, there's what's known as a replication crisis, which means, and this is, they first noticed this in psychology research, but it's kind of spread to basically a lot of medical research, which is that studies that many things in our society are based on can't be replicated. When they found all this social psychology research, things that everyone thought was true, someone else then does the same exact study and came out with a different result. So one of the things that Jay wants to do is replication. It's not sexy. If you're a researcher, why do you want to do someone else's study? You want to do your thing. You want to do the new thing. And that tends to be what's funded. So if they start funding replication studies, I think that's real science. That doesn't resolve all these other issues we talked about, a kind of groupthink problem that I think is so worrisome. But at least it will have that as a foundation. I don't know how people can have their trust restored when the people in charge so deeply failed us. It's this very serious problem, and I guess just piece by piece we can try to come up with slowly rebuilding trust. But I suspect it could be a generation before people are really going to regular quote unquote people. Are going to listen to and of course, I think what you were alluding to is, well, what happens, unlike COVID, what happens if there is something that's extraordinarily dangerous to children and no one's going to listen? The one bright side on this, one, potential good thing is, and I talk about this in the book, so I'll keep saying that, but is people tend to behave accordingly based on their threat level. And if there's a tornado coming, most people will get inside and hide in the bathtub or whatever you're supposed to do. If you see people dropping in the street from a virus, you're not sending your kid to school. And so the one positive way of looking at it doesn't mean, obviously there are some threats that we can't see that aren't obvious, and that's problematic. But at least if something is truly dangerous, people behave accordingly. And part of the problem with during the pandemic was there was an extraordinary disconnect between people's personal experience and what they were being told was reality. It was fairly stark. And just the statistics just bear this out. If 1 million people die, within a period of time, that is a tragedy. And I'm not minimizing that this was a horrible disease for a very select portion of our population. But we have 330 million people in America. The likelihood that you are going to personally know, not a friend of a friend or a distant person, oh yeah, I know that person. No, but like someone close to you. We're not close to 330 people, most of us are not that famous or popular. The fact of the matter is, very, very few people were actually directly touched by COVID, but we were all directly touched by the response to COVID. So that's a weird sort of bright spot in thinking about if something crazy happens in the future, people will act if they need to, I think.
Okay, well, with that, do you want to open it up? Just any questions?
Yeah, you mentioned Jay Bhattacharya. He was completely suppressed. He was blackballed.
That's true.
Why was he blackballed? What powers were blackballing him? Because he discovered he almost had, I think it was 30% people had been infected already. I think that was what his study showed in April.
Yeah. Well, Jay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. If someone wants, if they can come up and say their question into the microphone, or I can just repeat it. The person was mentioning about Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the NIH. Jay was I'm elaborating on your question. Just that Jay was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was basically a contrarian document to the pandemic response that said instead of shutting down society, we should focus protection on the people who are most vulnerable and figure out ways of doing that, and instead let the rest of society kind of go as they will. The thing that I think is interesting about that is that they were sort of maligned as saying, let it rip, let people, anyone could stay home if they wanted to. That's the thing that bothered me so much about school closures and there were people in my town who were adamant, we can't go back to school. And then once school opened hybrid, we can't go full time. I'm like, keep your kid home. What do you give a shit if my kid's in school? So that's one of the things that was frustrating about the criticism of Great Barrington was, if you're worried about it, schools were not forcing kids in. The schools that opened, not until much, much later. I am not aware of any schools that were open for in-person learning and required everyone to come in. And there were plenty of schools that were open, either in hybrid or fully open, and some portion of students stayed home. So the idea of Great Barrington, they're letting it rip, everyone's going to die. Stay the fuck home if you want. If you're afraid, stay home. Okay, most jobs were allowing people to do this, work remotely. So,
but his research was suppressed.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about his research being suppressed, but he was censored on Twitter. This is how Lee and I met, was the Twitter files. And I wrote about it with Lee and others. I'll say, just to kind of elaborate on your question just for 30 seconds. One of the things that I think about with censorship is that, yes, it's bad when it's obvious, like at social media, where the government had their boot on the neck of these social media companies. It's like, and they're like, well, they know there's no document that says you must censor this person. First of all, there may be with Alex Berenson in some instances, but putting that aside, you don't have to, nice social media company you got here. Shame if something happened to it. Just asking. We're just asking. Just talking about misinformation. The idea that wasn't censorship is absurd. In my view, that's censorship. There's no mistaking of what the government wanted, and they had a million levers they could pull against these companies, and they knew it, and they acted accordingly. But the thing that's I think gets lost in this sort of overt censorship is self-censorship. And most people, and I was contacted by doctors around the country, while I was writing a lot of my articles, and they would say to me, I agree with you. Thank you for writing this. I think this is terrible what's going on. Whether it was the schools shouldn't be closed, we shouldn't have 2-year-olds wearing masks, whatever it was, they're like, this is wrong. I think it's harmful. There's not good evidence behind this. There's evidence to the contrary. All the arguments are saying, but all this is off the record. And look, I'm sympathetic. People have a mortgage to pay. They have kids, they don't want to be either socially cast out or professionally. And many of them were warned and admonished. You are not allowed to say this at all. And I had many people tell me this, that they were not allowed to say anything that went against the CDC or against Fauci or the narrative. So that's the real censorship that's so problematic, is this sort of like internal censorship that the average American was unaware of. And then we were told this was essentially a manufactured consensus. It was false. We were told over and over, this is, the New York Times told me every day they were writing, experts say, ... We kept being told this over and over. That was fake. That was a manufactured consensus. I hate that. I feel like I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's just, that is what happened. This wasn't a real consensus. It was voices were suppressed either voluntarily or overtly.
Yeah, I'll just say also on the Dr. Bhattacharya thing, I don't know if censorship is the right word, but it was not conducive to, his experience was not conducive to free expression in an open society and debate, because you had Twitter amplifying public health officials who were calling him a Nazi and calling him, a threat to public safety.
And they were deboosting
him. And at the same time, there were other kind of less visible, but, again, I don't know if you call it censorship, but there were bureaucratic kind of investigations and his colleagues at Stanford really applying a lot of pressure. Right. So again, like, this isn't the jackboot of the government, forcing him to shut up, but it made it very difficult for him to carry out his research and speak out publicly. You want to go to the hat? Yeah.
Yeah, I know you talked, maybe it's in the book, a bit about modeling,
Mm.
and it seemed to me that the big problem, a huge problem, was the playing field was so skewed to the Imperial College model of depth. And once you have that number was exorbitant, it was huge. And it just allowed all sorts of manipulation with underneath that. So it's neat. I don't know if you speak in your book, but I know you've talked a little bit about.
Boy, are you in for a treat. I have a whole section on seductive models, because I love the play on words there.
Europe, is there, they built different models. The imperial model sort of came to the UK, and the United States, my understanding, was hedging. They weren't necessarily going, but there was some facts from deals. They went with the imperial model, college model.
Deborah Burke very much consulted Imperial College models, fact, and also IHME out of Washington State, which was even worse than Imperial. Like they had, and one of the things that that's so sad is that Imperial College, IHME had extraordinary amount of money from Bill Gates, and their models were just, a 3-year-old may have done better. Like, they were just so off. They had no idea what they're doing. Again, we want to get back to the expert class and worrying about not listening to the experts. The model. So I go into the models a lot because I think it's important and it's fascinating how wrong these people were. And one of the things I try to do, I don't know if you do this as a writer, in the back of my head, I always imagine, what if my dad was a modeler or someone I really knew? And so I try not to be an asshole about it, because I think these people genuinely want to do good work. I don't think these people are all assholes. They are spending their career trying to help society. So I always had that in the back of my head. I don't want to just go after them with a flamethrower. Now someone may read the book and come away and be like, dude, that was the flamethrower. But at least I tried to be sympathetic toward the errors while still being honest about all of the errors. The very tall gentleman in the back.
Not that tall.
Okay, well, the not as tall gentleman. You're on that. You're standing on a platform. Okay, all right.
It's actually perfect. I want to piggyback on what you just said.
Okay.
We're all equally prone to be fallible, but we're not all equally equipped to admit that we've done something wrong. I'm curious in your reporting. I'm less interested in revisiting the PTSD part of the book, but I'm curious in your reporting if any of the people you spoke with, the people you just spoke about, right, acknowledge that we got it wrong, and here's how we're thinking about the next time something like this comes along.
One of the things that shocked me when I talked with one of the modelers was, and this was a guy who got it right, by the way, and he doesn't work in public health, which I talk about how the people who got it right actually aren't professionals, which is kind of fascinating. And I said, here's what I don't understand. Each week or each month, don't they go back and like look at the models and do like kind of like a, like a Monday morning, like, let's see, who got it right. He's like, no, we don't really do that in modeling. People tend to not look back at that. So the only person I've seen with some degree of, and there may be others, but this is just my awareness. The only person I've seen with some sense of kind of awareness that he made a mistake was Francis Collins, who is the head of the NIH, Anthony Fauci's boss. And he apologized to Jay for calling him a fringe epidemiologist. And he also, in a public interview, he admitted, he said, we only focused on the disease. We didn't think through, he may even have said, we didn't care. We just weren't even thinking about these second order effects of what we were doing. And I was like, thank you for saying that, because that's exactly what I argue in my book. Thanks for admitting it. So that was a bit of an admission by him, but I'm not aware of any of these scientists themselves. I haven't seen, any of these people come out. I mean, have you seen Fauci apologize? No. I never said to close the school. Yeah. I never closed the schools. So yeah, you weren't there with the padlock, but so I'm not aware of anyone really apologizing for this. Redfield's an interesting character in all of this. He's sort of, yeah, I think he did. He's a little bit more in the team reality side, I think. But I also view him as less culpable. By the time Walensky is where the, really turned up the juice on the craziness. Lady here in the beret type of hat.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the way that you frame this discussion. If you could talk a little bit more about that, because I know there are some journalists who talk about there's a woman named Anna Margarita Alice or something who talks about mistakes were not made, and there's C.J. Hopkins talking about the rise of the new totalitarianism, and all of these kinds of having a framing which doesn't focus so much on bad decision making as though it happened in a green field, like we were just going about our business, we were doing our best, we did the best with the information that we had at the time, whether it was just citizens or whether it was public health or doctors at a hospital or teachers in a school. That framing that everybody just did their best versus, well, yeah, people did their best, but then there was also actual sort of harmful intent going on, saying okay, we're going to nudge people to take these behaviors. We're going to close the schools. We're going to isolate people. We come up with 6 feet out of thin air. I just want to talk about the framing, because there's something about the dissonance between those two sort of strands of discussion that I know it puzzles me, and I would like to know maybe how you approach that, or if you approach it in your book.
I think if I understand your question, you're sort of talking about intent versus just like an accident. Where I mean, there are multiple instances where they said, Anthony Fauci at one point said, if you're overreacting, then that means you're doing the right thing. There was some documents that I refer to that came out of England where part of their plan is you need to scare people to get them to behave a certain way. So, I mean, there are all sorts of government actors and people within public health who knew that if they had to turn the dials up in order to get compliance on things. And I would argue the media did the same thing. They acted as a megaphone, continuing to just keep cranking the dial up to get people afraid and get them to behave. We're going to do one last question here.
Can I also add that
go ahead.
I might be misinterpreting your question.
I may not have answered your question.
Yeah, so apologies if I am. I'm not going to impute the wrong thing. But I think there's a way to write the book that you wrote that kind of casts it as there's a gigantic conspiracy or an attempt to get us into an authoritarian society that was kind of this manifest monolithic thing. Okay. And you would have sold a lot more books. And kudos to you to not do that, to keep it. There's some bad intent. There were bad actors. There were bad decisions, but you were rigorous in just documenting what you know and what you don't know, and not kind of inflaming it beyond that.
Lee answered the question better than I. Thank you for translating for me. Yes, thank you. Yes, I don't think there was because there are people who say that I don't think there was a vast conspiracy to, to create an authoritarian state. There were, instances, and there are plenty of examples of them scaring people on purpose and doing other things. But by and large, the whole purpose of the book is like an anatomy of decision making. How is it that all of these people came to make very poor decisions? So that to me, right, it's less sexy.
It's less sexy, but
it's not,
you're doing the
not,
right thing.
It's not going to get people jazzed up.
Yeah.
But for me, I find that more interesting than the conspiracy, because it's like, how do things work? How is it that we are making choices in life that come out with, very bad consequences? And how does, not just as individuals, but as a society and as institutions? And I tried my best to explain that, to say, here's why all these people made these bad choices. And I don't think it's because they're bad people. I think it's because they're part of a system and the way many human beings act.
Right on.
Oh, before I give the mic back to Dan, I just want to thank Dan for hosting this event and his wife, Sandra. Thank you so much for, you're a champion here. This is a fabulous event. If anyone else's fingers are turning blue like mine, I don't know that. So everyone's still toughing it out here before it starts snowing. But thank you so much, Dan. I want to thank Lee. This is I've been a fan of Lee's work when we first met a few years ago for a long time. And it's just awesome to have you here with me doing the event. And obviously, this is so crazy and awesome to have everyone come here. Over 100 people bought tickets to come here. It's really awesome. This is basically as good as it'll ever get for me professionally and personally. This is super, super amazing. I am so grateful. I'm very humbled by it. I feel like we are our tribe of people. So you guys are awesome. And I'm so just touched that people are here. And I would just say that the last piece, I'm not going to get rich off the book, so I'm not trying to plug the book. And you already bought it, but books sell by word of mouth more than anything. I've done a lot of media. People you're all over the media. That has an impact, but it's really word of mouth when people talk to people face to face or texting, whatever it is. So if you find that the book is interesting and persuasive, please try to talk to your friends, maybe get some normies if we can. But I tried my best to not only write for a specific audience. I don't want to just preach to the choir. That's boring. I really, really, and that's why MIT Press bought the book. My editor is not on Team Reality really, but she was persuaded, kudos to her, because she was persuaded by the argument that I was making and the evidence I presented. And I just hope we can reach some, and that's what she wanted. She's like, we've got to reach those people. What happened was wrong. And we really need to reach her people, the MIT, Cal, Berkeley type of people. So if you can talk to your friends, if you find it persuasive, because what we don't want to happen is for this sort of convenient and exculpatory narrative to develop where it's we did the best we could. It was a fog of war. We were building the plane as we fly, all this stuff. That is the official narrative. That is what the health officials are saying now. That is what Matt Iglesias was tweeting the other day. That's what the New York Times, this is what we hear, is that they did the best they could. Actually, I'm not sure that's what Matt tweeted. He had a different point that I think was wrong. But regardless, sorry. But regardless, word of mouth spreads books, and the point of the book is to help establish a history. This thing happened. This happened. There's not a lot of documentation of it. And certainly not, I don't think, what I've done here. So if anyone, all of you are here because you think this is important. So just spread the word so we can kind of at least have some portion of society carry on in the future and know what actually happened.
Yeah, right. Can we give it up for Dave?
Yes,
thank you. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks again for coming. There's still plenty of food. I do have 2 teenage boys, so we could have an after party, but do eat and drink. There's coolers up here, not that you want it cold right now.
Oh, I'll sign. Tell him I'll sign books.
Yeah, and yeah, that was my main objective was to say, David, there's books out on the tables right now. You know, if you bought a ticket, you have a book. David's free to sign some to sign books for you, and so I don't. You probably want to move indoors.
Yeah, let's do the silent inside.
Yeah. So thanks for coming, everybody, and keep up the fight.
Thanks, man. That was awesome. That was great, man.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
it really did.
Take your mic.
Oh, yeah.
We just hit the button.
Yeah,
Fingers are blue.